Welcome to the Unleashed This podcast. This will be our second session of this series entitled Why Businesses Need Microservices Applications with our guest today, Beth Macknik. Welcome, Beth, to this podcast of ours.
Well, thanks, Muhammad. Glad I could join you.
Absolutely. Last week we had a podcast focused on B2B e-commerce, which is really interesting and insightful. With Ryan, who's our VP of operations, and just by way of introduction, Beth is our lead developer in our Symfony division. And today, the focus, as I mentioned, is on the role of microservice applications. And so why not? Let's just jump into it. I mean, with a specific view on businesses, but I understand that microservice applications has applicability across, for all types of customers, right? B2B, B2C, and so. My question to you, my first question is, what is a microservice application? What does it do?
Well, a microservice is an implementation architecture choice. And what a microservice is it's a very focused piece of an application that preferably does one thing really well. And so then you decouple from other parts of your application. So great example is, say, an e-commerce site where you could have what we call a monolithic application that has the shopping cart, the catalog, the checkout. You can go track your packages, etc. Or you can choose to modularize that and take a piece out like tracking and make that a standalone microservice, so that managing tracking of packages through your tracking vendors, through your shipping partners, is just a dedicated piece of code that can be used then by multiple applications.
Thank you for that. Yeah, let's deep dive into that. So, there's clearly a distinction. There's the microservice application is, in my view, is a further deep dive, right, into a particular capability and really enhancing that capability. Do you have a viewpoint on, just to sort of dovetail to sort of last week's discussion around B2B, B2C? My initial impression is that a microservice app could be applicable to all things, all customers, but is particularly useful in the B2B context, right? Because there's something about, being able to specialize and maximize that capability that will particularly help a business.
One of the nice things you can do when you do a microservice is you can put what's called an API, an application programming interface, on it. That's how microservices talk to one another and talk to other applications within your business. But when you do that, you can then, for things where it makes sense, make that API available to your customers so that their computer systems can check in on the tracking. So if you're doing industrial, say you're a drop shipping provider for a front end, they can sit there and go check tracking, and they can have their programmers access the API. And now you don't have people on the phones answering questions, and they don't have people on the phones having to call you. And you have a win-win with your customer, where you're both lowering your costs and increasing satisfaction.
And you can't do that necessarily with a more monolithic app, right?
Well, you can, but there are more problems.
Right.
You don't when you open up an API, you have security concerns that if you have a monolithic application that's also keeping track of credit cards and such, you would have to really pay attention to your security needs if it's all in one app, because you have an API there that's accessing a system that contains proprietary data. Or if you have a microservice that's separate, it's standing alone, it's running on a separate computer, and you're accessing it, all it has in it is tracking information. Well, that's not nearly as much of a need for security as your e-commerce financial pieces. And so it makes it a separation of concerns really a lot easier, and a lot that you can put more layers. We do security through onion layers, right? We don't have one way of doing security. You have several steps along the way, just like you secure your warehouse by having not having windows in the building.
Right.
And, so no one's breaking the window. Well, you don't want to do it in your office building because you really do want windows where you have people working. But for your warehouse, you don't need windows. So you just get rid of the windows. And then now you don't have to worry about people breaking the windows to get in. And so those kinds of security things happen in development too. When you take an API and you move it over, now I can sit there and not put any windows or the equivalent on the financials while still making the API available to the client, out to the world, in a much more in a different security environment. You could still have security on it, but you would have a different kind of, it'd be a little bit closer to the outside of the onion.
Right. Yeah, I love that, because I think what you're describing is essentially kind of like, structuring security effectively, right? Like let's start with the original. How do you make it more secure? You don't necessarily need to reinvent the system, right? Or restructure it, right? You just focus on those areas that you want it to be more secured. And that's what a microservice application does, right? Let's deep dive into that. Like, it sounds like there's a bit of decoupling that happens, right?
Absolutely.
And can you speak to that? I mean, that sounds like, how does that address sort of the, is there a pain point that a microservice application addresses? I think you touched on it a little bit with security, but can decoupling do other things besides improving security?
Decoupling is both it's a two-sided sword. The huge advantages of it is you can work. You don't have a dependency on one or the other. So let's say you have an e-commerce store and you've decoupled your tracking. If you need to take the tracking server down because FedEx has changed their API and you need to update it, you can take tracking down without taking down your store. So that while that update is in progress, basically when a client comes in and says, hey, I want to track my package, you say, I'm sorry, this isn't available right now. Can you come back in 15 minutes? But you can still buy something. And so you're not dependent on when FedEx makes changes or when UPS makes changes, and that doesn't take your store down because the tracking is a separate piece and still can be managed. And we have all sorts of things like that. Software these days are in many ways living organisms that need care and security updates and all of that. And when you couple everything together, you have to take it down every time any one piece of it has to be changed. If you decouple it and move out pieces, then those things can be done independently. And particularly if they aren't an absolute requirement to be running, then you've made yourself a space where you can keep your core business going, even when other things are in a transitory update cycle or other issue.
To me, that's as we talk to our clients, right, in different sectors, manufacturing, banking, it's those updates, right, that can really hurt you, right? Because, there's a risk of disruption, a risk of an outage. And so to me, this pain point addresses the resilience. This solution, microservice app, addresses the pain point of resiliency or lack thereof resiliency, right?
Yes.
And it sounds like, that does, is a huge positive, right, to ensuring that a business not just feels secure long-term, but can be safe in the knowledge that, they're not going to be disrupted tomorrow, right? When somebody's engaging on their e-commerce site, as an example.
Yeah, you minimize the number of disruptions. And you can get yourself to much closer to 100% uptime on your core functionality that your business is dependent on.
Right. The other pain point I think you sort of hinted at this, especially with the description on APIs, is this advantage with microservice apps in terms of connecting different systems, like connecting legacy assets with new functionality. What is it about microservice applications that can enhance a business's capability?
Well, when you pull these pieces apart and you take the tracking piece out, for example, or you take other pieces out of your functionality, you then can use it in more than one system. Now you have a tracking system that's talking to your e-commerce site, but it also can talk to your phone bank
Right.
software where your internal personnel are managing calls with customers.
Which it wasn't before, right? Which it wasn't before. That Trackers was only doing one thing for shipping, and now it's doing other things for,
Right.
yeah.
Back in the day of monolithic applications, you would probably have one application that worked for your calls center and another one on the website, and they wouldn't 100% match. And the customer would call after looking at the website, and the rep would say, "Oh, well, what I see is this." And now the customer is wondering why they're getting two stories from you. And it's just because you're using a later version of the FedEx interface or something silly like that. But this way, you're doing one system all the way along, and you're only paying for developing that tracking system once.
One time.
So it's not, it's usable within the company, and not just for development, but maintaining it, keeping it up and running, keep making sure the connectivity's there. It's much easier to keep a microservice up and running because it's limited in what it does. There's very few things that can fail. So you're not sitting there going, is this failing because I can't talk to the Visa credit card processor, or is it failing because I can't talk to FedEx?
Right.
Well, it's not talking to Visa. It's just talking to the shipping provider. So it's got to be one of those. So it definitely narrows your focus down much faster if there is a problem.
Yeah, I can see how the maintenance costs would be far less, right? Because, you've sort of eliminated sort of any possible risks outside of the core, usage of it. The other thing that's interesting is the internal versus external. You might have a service like a tracking thing that would be focused on customers, but then that could actually, well, the example you gave was it's available for us, but then we can spread it to other customers essentially, right? And to be able to have it be used. So there's a sort of an internal external benefit to it. Some, in the past monolithic applications, we would be just focused on the customer, wouldn't have any benefit for internal for employees and vice versa, right? So there is sort of cross-functional kind of benefits there with a microservice app.
Well, and it also expands which of your staff have access. So if you turn this into a public facing piece, you've always had your call center be able to handle those questions from the client. But now your salesperson who has the phone and he's meeting with a client in person can bring it up too.
Yeah.
Right. And in a way that wasn't doable before. So by implementing it as a microservice kind of functionality, you can give, where it makes sense, everybody access to the data that you want everyone to have access to, and really make it very, very efficient in terms of managing load and all of that.
One follow-up question, and I think you've clearly laid out the massive benefits of a microservice application for a business. But when do you think a business needs a microservice app? Is there like a way, a kind of guidepost in terms of how to think about, when a business should engage in a microservice application?
There are a couple of microservices require a little more tweaking when you set them up, and because you're always communicating over the network with them. So there are places where it doesn't necessarily make sense to set up a microservice. But what you want to do is evaluate the business needs when you're creating a system, and look out like a couple years, right? Because when you do custom software, you want to look out where's the business going to be 2 years from now, and build things and definitely break out into a microservice if you have something that you want to expose to the world, but you want to keep your core application not exposed to the world. That's a good indication for a microservice. If you have something that has to scale in load, and I use tracking applications because if you're a consumer, direct to consumer, usually Christmas is like a much bigger load time of year for almost every consumer business. And so you may have 5-10 times as many people checking tracking in December as you do in February. So you can scale microservice pretty easily. So anything that you need to scale up, or you can sit there and say, oh, I just need to make duplicates of this so that I have 5 times the capacity in December and people get an answer really quick than I do in February. That's one of the things that says that's a microservice. You need a microservice there. And you want to look at where that will be in the future for a business, and where you can go with those kinds of capabilities, it really makes everything work out fairly well for folks.
No, I love that. The scaling. I mean, that ties into, growth. I mean, there's themes here, right? In terms of, there's also potential microservice application uses in terms of cost savings, right? So I think the broader message that I hear from you is, folks who want to engage in a microservice application have to have a really good vision around their business, right? And really understanding what is that application, meant to do, right? To the top line.
When you're developing business systems, you really need to be engaged with what is the needs of the business. There isn't a cookie cutter solution. I mean, there's lots of e-commerce out there, but building a system for a particular business, you need to look at how is that business operating, and what's critical to them, and where their pain points are. And they're different in different businesses. And so if you're trying to apply a cookie cutter solution, you may not get the system you want.
And I think that's the advantage of a microservice app over a monolithic app, right? Because monolithic apps are basically cookie cutter solutions, right? Microservice apps allow real flexible solutioning towards the specific pain point that you have. Right?
Yes. You can put your resources towards the things that you need the most. If you're a major industrial vendor and you're not shipping in high volumes, you don't need the scalability of shipping, but you do need a lot more API access to let people know, because you might probably are using multimodal shipping. And so the ability to share that out via an API is important. So those are two different kinds of companies that still both want to use a microservice, but for different reasons.
Right. Yeah. In that case, volume, maybe high volume of shipping versus more multimodal, which basically means like you've got multiple modes of shipping and in smaller volumes, right? And so there's on more of a qualitative rather than a quantitative.
Yeah. You're probably not going to have a point where you have like 1,000 people checking their tracking at the same time if you're shipping big industrial pieces, but you are very likely to have, is it on the train or has it been transferred over to the semi yet? Right. And can my computer check that so that I'm not having to pay someone to log it?
Right. And that's where the microservice app comes into play. You are our lead Symfony developer, and I'm curious, there are certain code bases, of course, that are more advantageous to the development of microservice apps. Why is Symfony so suitable here for microservice application development?
One of there's a couple of reasons. One, Symfony is built on top of PHP, and PHP as a language is the most heavily used language on the internet for building sites. That's not always you don't always want to use just because it's the most used, but it's one of those things where down the road, making a business system is an investment, and you don't want to be going 5 years from now and have a hard time finding people who can work on your system because they don't have experience with it. Symfony is one of the most used frameworks. It is the most base framework. Even there are other frameworks in PHP that build on top of Symfony. Magento is built on top of Symfony. Drupal is built on top of Symfony. Laravel is built on top of Symfony. So it's a very strong base for that. The other thing that Symfony has that's particularly good for microservices is a feature called API Platform, which is hands down the most popular way of setting up APIs anywhere. Makes it really a lot easier and quicker, and therefore cheaper for the developer to develop a good API. It's a really strong tool set for developers. So that's one of the reasons that Symfony is just a fantastic base for it.
Yeah, I was just going to add, just to sort of for the audience, we, at Unleashed, of course, we do all those, platforms that are based on Symfony, right? Drupal, you name it, Laravel, and of course Symfony itself, which has its own, opportunities as well for development. So all of those, and that's partly because we are Symfony experts, right? As a consequence, deep diving further into sort of microservices apps and sort of maybe provide some examples. Can you speak to an example from your time in terms of a microservices app that really provided kind of an immediate return to a business client?
Absolutely. So working with a railroad, built uh, a gateway, shall we say, series of microservice apps that talk to their back enterprise systems on the back end. And they'd had a merger, and they had two different incompatible back ends,
Ah, right.
but they needed one interface.
That happens.
Oh, absolutely.
In an M&A transaction, right? You have two legacy systems, and what do you do in that situation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And replacing them, you're probably talking hundreds of millions of dollars to switch. So what they did instead was they paid us to come up with an API that tied in that microservices that tied into each one, and then they were able to put a front end piece on it, so it looked like you're only talking to one system. And the microservices handled talking to these legacy systems, which each had their own way of doing things. So the microservice became this very accessible piece that they started using for their, to begin with, their executive dashboards was the first thing. They wanted to know where the business was, and they couldn't really tell when they had two sets of reports and they're trying to, by hand, put the two reports together. And then, moving from there, they started having, okay, where are our systems in terms of maintenance? So we've got rolling stock that needs to have its brakes worked on, and it, once it goes a certain number of miles, or kilometers in that case, it needs to go into a shop and have the brakes checked. And it was hard to manage the rolling stock because it was only, it was in both systems and was only updated kind of haphazardly. Once the API was in there with a microservice, the mechanics were working with one interface and it would update both systems.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So big plus, because then they had us optimize it. So, well, don't send it into the shop until it's almost out of time. We want to keep it rolling and making money until we hit that. And we actually put in a whole calculation on how close am I to a depot that needs, when I'm empty. And so they reduced their cost of managing rolling stock by about 20%.
Wow.
For just routine maintenance.
What I love about that example is that it's sort of a mirror, right? Like the hardware and the software, in the sense that, they had legacy software assets that they were maximizing through the use of a microservice app, right? Almost like two competing infrastructures there, right? With the merger. And then separately, it actually had that microservice app had huge benefits also on the hardware side, right? They were able to essentially extend the life cycle, right, of rolling stock, right, in such a way that, certainly more than sort of the originally envisioned duration, right? And that's what a microservice app does. It enables tracking of, when rolling stock is, almost at the verge, but, we want to continue on and then, prepare that for transition, right? But the microservice app can track that. And so, that's, to me, is just, I think for any C-suite person, that's helpful, right? From the standpoint of trying to maximize both software and hardware assets. Next question to ask is, I know at Unleashed, we have been, focused also on developing microservices apps. I know there's one example with one of our manufacturing clients called Find a Rep. Can you share that example of that particular application?
Sure. So the Find a Rep application is a microservice that allows them to enter in their sales territories for their representatives that are doing industrial sales, and what their territories are. They each get a territory for sales for region, and then it has an interface on it that you can go find. If my address is this, who are my reps? And it actually has several different types for different types of lines of business. Who are my reps? And so I can see for all the different lines of business who my salesperson is, or sales firm. That they put that in, and then they leveraged it. So it's available to their internal call center through one interface. It's also available out on the internet by anybody who's on the website can go do a search for it. And it is possible actually to access it also through a third-party API, and put in an address that and come back with, what the reps are, and have complete control over these sales territories, so they can set them up any way they like, and have a system that handles all of this, and then it ties in with their other systems, and they're looking at adding a couple of systems that it ties into because they said this is central to their business, and it made it really clear to us that it's their number one software piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like that example is great because it speaks to sort of kind of our role in B2B e-commerce. When we think of e-commerce, particularly, we think of it sort of in the B2C context, and we think of carts and that type of thing, like product details, all of that. But in B2B e-commerce, right, the relationship is very unique, right, because you've got maybe a distributor network, right, and so the relationship is more of a customer lifetime relationship. And so I think something like this, where you have a find a rep, kind of solution or application, really is sort of a way to kind of connect, the customer, a distributor, let's say, with that manufacturing, in this case, our manufacturing client, in ways that allow real interaction. So, for instance, you were saying, okay, that information is available online. It can also be available by third-party API, right? They can access it to their employees, on the distributor side, right? And in that way, I think, proves the point around microservice applications. It really is powerful, and it can be, adapted in different ways for customers.
Yes, and as the ability to the whole idea of a channel is different in the B2B space than the B2C. And you're much more likely to be working with a lot more partners who are actively working with you, whereas in the B2C space, you often have partners, you have stores and such that you may be selling through, but they're not interacting with you as much. You're you get an order, you ship it to them, you hope they sell it.
Yeah. It's not like that sort of continued engagement that you need. And I think a microservice app facilitates that continued engagement, right? A deep relationship, right? I think this is interesting. I know that in the case of, one of our other developers, Symfony Developers, also built this tool called the Business Travel Resumption Tool, for one of our clients at Unleashed. And during the pandemic, it provided real-time information to the end clients of our client, who provided business intelligence to their clients, latest updates on what's going on in Southern Africa, right? Beyond what the U.S. State Department would provide. It would be information that would be collated. And the microservice application, based in Symfony, would facilitate the provision of that information to their clients. So it was a really powerful tool, discreetly made, right, to provide information, to facilitate information very quickly, on a country-by-country basis. I think there's just plenty of these sort of examples, right, where deepening the relationship, that connection, right, with end customers is really, this microservice application methodology approach can really help do that. We talked about immediate returns, right? Any examples of a long-term return? I know short-term returns are like, okay, immediate example, information is provided, but is there something that you can share from your experience regarding kind of a long, like speaking to that, sort of customer lifetime value?
Sure. Well, what tends to happen with microservices is you start finding new uses for it. When you can access it, you start to leverage it. So that's exactly what happened with the railroad I was talking about. That interface was originally built for an immediate need of the dashboard and just where is our rolling stock.
Yeah.
And then they leveraged it over time to, well, now we can build this thing without a lot of work. And also major corporations like railroads, or even medium-sized corporations, there are people in different departments. And if you do a monolithic app that touches everything, you need all of the departments working together to help make that a success. and you never have the same level of engagement across all the different departments. There's the department that has the most pain, that's really involved and really talking to the developer, when we want this. And then there's another department that's like, okay, this touches us, but it isn't key, and I've got other things to do. So um, when you have the microservice, what tends to happen is you're not interfacing with as many departments when you're building it. And that's certainly what happened at the railroad. It was like the maintenance guys realized they could do this without having to talk to the guys who actually, quote unquote, owned the rolling stock, and get them involved, because they really didn't care. And the maintenance guys like the idea of lowering their costs. So that's the kind of thing you transition to that really gives you a long-term benefit off of microservices, in addition to the fact that it lowers your cost of operating your systems, because you only have to scale up the part of your system that is needing more load.
Right.
So if you are growing as a company, which is fantastic, you don't necessarily have all of the pieces need to grow at the same rate. And so with a microservice architecture, these are usually built in a scalable fashion, and you scale up the parts that are under the most load, without having to scale up the pieces that maybe don't take that much of a hit, and really keep your costs down. The classic microservice architecture is Netflix, right? As a company, and it's easy for people to picture Netflix. They've got a gazillion microservices. They have people whose entire job is to keep track of all the microservices. And that's makes a lot of sense when you're that big and you're serving that much off of your computer systems. But you definitely can then ramp up differently. So for example, when they have a new show drop, they know that they get a spike in viewership. And so when a popular show comes up and they have a new set of episodes coming online, they're able to sit there and ramp up the microservices that serve that, just as they make it live. So no one has the experience of waiting for a slow computer, even though 10 million people just logged in because they knew this was coming on tonight.
Right.
So it definitely, that's an extreme example, but you see it even at lower ends, like our Finder Rep client. We increased the number of Finder Rep instances they had as their load went up.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it enables to scale. I think it's this ability to prioritize, right? To help a business prioritize those areas that are growing and then scale accordingly, right?
Yes.
I think a microservice app does that so much better than a monolithic app, clearly.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, monolithic apps are often they're not only not, just bigger and you have to scale it all together, but they often aren't designed. Monolithic apps generally are not designed for scaling. So you can't just make another copy and have them work together. Right. That usually doesn't work. You usually have to sit and spend significant development dollars in order to get your monolithic app to expand its capability as you grow. Whereas microservices are usually designed from the beginning to be scalable.
Yeah, it goes back to the prior discussion that we just had, right? About how, the whole thing about, multimodal versus, volume transactions or volume, shipments. It allows you to prioritize. Microservices apps allows you to prioritize, and it allows you to be, I think, in that way, able to respond and go to market, respond to the market, and then go to the market that much more quickly, right? To respond to that need in the market, that demand in the marketplace, right? That's a great. I love that the railroad example is such a great example, because I think it's the railroad industry example, because it's a more old economy industry that can truly benefit from these microservice application innovations. I know that our company has also Unleashed has worked with a client on a learning management system. Can you speak to the use of a microservice app, by the way, to facilitate kind of the diffusion of a learning management system? Can you speak to that example a little bit?
Sure. We're working on a learning management system that offers training for folks in fire safety and firefighters and such. It's a learning management system that they already have in place, that they've got a solution, but we are expanding its capability greatly. And we're doing it in a microservice architecture so that they have more capabilities than they currently have. Of now, you can log into the site and take a class, but if your boss wants to see that you took the class, you have to like print out the transcript and take it to them.
Right.
Which is a little difficult for like the Los Angeles Fire Department is huge, right? Or Cal Fire in California, which is like 10,000 firefighters or more. So instead, what they're going to have is a microservice that actually manages what's called a learning record store capability, where they'll be able to have fire departments access an API through these microservices to get information on their firefighters to automatically give them credit for their continuing education, which is very important to their careers. Sometimes it is monetary, depending on the department. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone that information starts flowing in a much better way. And the microservice architecture means that this can scale appropriately for everybody involved. So that if they have more people taking courses at a time, that will scale up. If they've got more analysis going on, that part of the system can scale up and down.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we talked about, right? How do you leverage an existing LMS and then expand its capabilities? Well, you can do that with a microservice app, right? And spread that knowledge across a wider, effectively, group of people through the use of APIs as well, right? The microservice app is connected to an API interface in a system, and then you can connect with multiple firefighters across many fire departments across the country.
Yes.
We've talked all about the benefits of microservices applications. Let's talk about some of the risks, because there are always risks in everything, right? What are the key risks in your view with a microservice application architecture and deployment?
Well, when they're a little more work to set up at the beginning, because you're building them to be scalable, and you're decoupling. So you've got APIs that need to talk back and forth, and that's a little bit more work on the development side. It's not huge, a lot more, but it is a real thing. Also, you need to now monitor multiple systems and make sure they're working. So you need to monitor in an e-commerce. You need to monitor your core system. You might have a microservice that's providing your catalog. You might have a microservice that's providing your warehouse information, and one that's handling your tracking. And so now you've got 4 systems that need to be monitored, which is not a lot, but you can get way out of control. When microservices first became a thing, like anything, there were people who jumped on the bandwagon, and it's like everything's a microservice, and so people designed e-commerce systems that had like 50 microservices, and and they're all talking to each other, and you've got a real babble of communications going back and forth, and it's hard to follow what's going on. And it really didn't add any value, right? So the decoupling is great when there are like business reasons that you're decoupling. Occasionally there's some technical reasons, but decoupling for the sake of decoupling doesn't make a lot of sense. There are times where it's just easier to have pieces be together, because they always have to be used together. You're never, ever going to have a e-commerce shopping cart site that doesn't always have a web page being displayed. So decoupling those two things into 2 different microservices just for the sake of saying I'm a microservice isn't very useful.
And I think that goes to sort of the heart of the matter, right? Like, first, there is such a thing as too many microservice apps because it's hard to manage, I think, right? That. I think the other thing that's interesting is this is why you have a core platform or core application that arguably is part of a sort of consolidated, dare I say, even monolithic app. But then there are separate from core microservices applications, right? Where perhaps you don't have many, but you have some that you recognize that you have to prioritize, that word again, prioritization, and that you have to scale up, right? That a monolithic app and a consolidated app could not do by itself, right?
Absolutely. And sometimes you have things that eventually grow if you're lucky, if you get really big. If, for example, Netflix is a great example. You load up a Netflix web page, you have the page is actually put together by 8 different web microservices or something like that, just for the one page, right?
Yeah.
Which makes absolute sense if you can pay an entire team of engineers to sit and watch your microservices all day.
Right.
It's not something you want to do if you're smaller than Netflix.
Right.
But happy to build it for you if you're moving in that kind of revenue space. But you want to always take your technologies and match it up with your business and the goals of the business and the needs of the business. Don't add costs just because you can.
Yep. I hear you. And I think that's the rule of thumb here, right? Kind of the prevailing rule of thumb is you've got to have a business reason, right? If you want to build a microservice app, there's got to be something about growth around scalability or something else, maybe variability. Maybe there's a lot of to your point around seasonality of Christmas sales, right? Maybe that's where it's perfect to deploy a microservice app to address that seasonality, that variation in sales, right? It's got to have a good compelling business reason behind that.
Yes. Absolutely.
I know we talked about firefighting in particular. One question that comes up, and I think this is a question that's common to all our Unleash This podcast, and because it's near and dear to my heart and our company, because we want to think about how technology not only, helps our clients, which is of course of paramount concern, but also broader society, particularly folks that are perhaps not as immediate beneficiaries of technology, right? In the way we traditionally think of it. I guess my next question is, how can microservice apps help communities, especially supporting or helping, underserved communities?
Well, one of the things you get with microservices is you get to tailor things a little bit more for what you're dealing with. The fire service app is a great example. You've got Los Angeles, which is a big metropolis, and everybody's got great high-speed internet access. And then you've got northern rural California, where internet access is a challenge, but you still have fire departments with massive fires, like the Paradise Fire. And so those people need training too. And by having things in a microservice that you can have a very focused video handling there, you can serve these smaller communities or ones that are often like in particular in like the Paradise is a good example, that there are 2 tribes right near there that don't have great internet access.
Right.
But they do have firemen who need to get ongoing training, and being able to access a system that can scale to them and work at the needs they have for networking, while still providing the really high speed connectivity for Los Angeles, is a really powerful kind of thing. That's much easier to deliver when you're breaking these systems down into focused microservice pieces.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? It goes back to sort of, microservice applications enables a maximization of resources for very specific objectives, right? So you're not, wasting a lot of resources in the process, right? And so you can target effectively, right, underserved communities in a rural area like, Central California, right, where they're, being hit hard by fires. I know that that's, to me, that what I'm most proud of, in the work around our LMS for our client, learning management system for our client, is that it enables a spreading of that knowledge, distribution of that knowledge across the whole country, right? Targeted at fire departments, right? And in that sense, that's where a microservice application really thrives. It's the targeting of that maximum knowledge base, in an effective and efficient manner. I know we're about at time, but one of my last question really relates to with all this talk of, generative AI, ChatGPT, how do you think the advent of the cloud and especially AI, generative AI, how does that impact microservice applications? I mean, how does that impact, particularly the business's use of microservice applications?
One of the things about the generative AI that everyone's experiencing right now, I mean, machine learning has been increasing in use for a couple of decades now. And it's heavily used in managing microservices. In terms of that scaling, there's generally a machine learning element if you have any kind of significant size, where it's like it's learning to expand and contract how many things are, instead of having like a set parameter. It has a feedback loop in the machine learning where the computer actually learns to anticipate, oh, you just put a new season of The Crown up, I better run up some more servers right now. And no engineer has to do it. It learns to do it, and then it starts managing it. But so that kind of piece has been there for a long time. But the other side that's interesting that everyone has recently seen with Chat GPT and such is the generative ability of AI to communicate in language that everyone understands, even if you're asking it technical questions. You can put a technical question into Chat GPT and it'll come back with a really understandable answer for a layperson if that's what you ask for it. Well, you can start sharing information that way. There's an API for Chat GPT.
Right.
And you can use that to share information about where your systems are. So like, if you have 6 microsystems running on your e-commerce site and you want to know what's happening and what's going on, you can ask your engineers and you will get a very nerdy answer. But you could also potentially set it up so that there's a status page internally that tells management, here's what's happening, and explains it. And it's not the engineers having to sit and write it out, because we all know that nerds are, well, yeah, not their thing. Ask Chat GPT to explain it.
Yeah.
And put that text in. I think we're going to see a lot of things leveraged that way. Chat GPT is and of itself lends itself very well to implementation talking with microservices.
Right. Yeah. And I think to your point, right, there's another layer of monitoring and communication, right, that the generative AI allows. And it allows, that sort of artificial intelligence to address immediate concerns and monitor and warn us about things that are happening, with a microservice application or, whatnot. And then, that enables the human element to then take over. But, it does save us a lot of time, right? And provides that efficiency and that productivity, for us, right? Even as we're monitoring, like to your point before, right? This might be a situation where, this enables an engineer, let's say, to be able to monitor more microservice applications, because there's AI, there's an LLM-based learning, a machine model there, right? That's actually able to, track these microservice applications and see how they're doing, right, in the process. One last question. How do you think organizations will take advantage of microservice applications in the future?
Oh, I think microservices are going to continue to grow with businesses as they understand what they can break out, what makes sense, and have an opportunity to have pieces that really do what they need separately. That's definitely going to be just a growth area in terms of development for everyone. I don't think there's any real question in terms of those pieces. I expect to see microservices grow quite a bit in all areas of the business, as we're coming into a space where it's been hard to get employees, and that isn't going to change.
Yeah.
In terms of staffing and such, because the baby boomers are retiring, and we don't, so we're having to automate more things.
Yep.
And microservices are a great way to do that, because you can do it a piece at a time.
Right. And scale accordingly. Right. Well,
Yes.
this has been great, Beth. Thank you for this wonderful conversation around, microservice applications and why businesses need those, right, to grow and prosper in the future. And thank you to the audience. Thanks for joining us on the Unleash This podcast today. As always, if folks out there have any more questions or want to dig deeper on any of the topics we covered today, you can connect with us at unleash-technologies.com. It's below our names there. We'd love to keep the conversation going and help you make the best technology choices for your company. Until next time, keep that technology unleashed. Thank you.